I didn't know what to expect this morning, neither out of the weather nor out of our attendance, but I am pleased. And the visitors we have today have made up for some of the loss of those that maybe just weren't able to get out this morning. And it sure is good to have you with us. What I've been doing, about once a month, I've been preaching through the book of 1 Timothy. This picture captures what's going on in this epistle. Paul leaves the younger man, Timothy, at Ephesus to straighten some things out. But he didn't leave him alone. He sent this letter to him, and the idea is, now you can read this letter, and this will authorize you. People will see that what you are doing here at Ephesus, you're doing by apostolic authority because you have that letter. Well, that's what we're doing. We're reading this letter, and the authoritative things in that letter that applied to that church at Ephesus coming from an apostle, we're looking at how they apply to us. And this morning I want to look at a passage that's often misused, and I want to make sure we look at what is around it. Sometimes we forget what is around it because of the passage, but we've come to this. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 21 through 25. I charge thee before God and the Lord Jesus Christ and the elect angels. You hear the authority behind that? It says that thou observe these things without preferring one another, doing nothing by partiality. Lay hands suddenly on no man, neither be partaker of other man's sins. Keep thyself pure. And then this, drink no longer water, but use a little wine for thy stomach's sake and thine off infirmities. Some men's sins are open beforehand, going before the judgment, and some men they follow after. Likewise also the good works of some are manifest beforehand, and they that are otherwise cannot be hid. Let's see what's going on here. Let's look at the context. The context surrounding this verse of drink no longer water, but use a little wine. The immediate context doesn't seem to help a lot, but we want to make sure we're paying attention to this. Paul has been talking about elders, about their authority, but also about their accountability. Elders, they can sin. Elders are not without error. And so against an elder, receive not an accusation, but before 2 or 3 witnesses. And them that sin, rebuke before all, that others may fear. You don't get a free pass when you become an elder to do things that you wouldn't do otherwise if you were not an elder. Sin is still sin. And then skipping the little difficult part, look how this context flows. He says, observe these things without preferring one another, doing nothing by partiality, and lay hands suddenly on no man. Now, we're talking about elders that sin and their accusation. And so you look at that lay hands suddenly on no man, it almost sounds like you're seizing them, like you're going to arrest them or something. But we don't do that anyway. It's not a physical laying on of hands that we do when someone is in error. I guess it could mean don't be too quick to accuse them. But there's something else here that follows when it says some men's sins are open beforehand, going before the judgment. And some men they follow after. Likewise, also the good works of some are manifest beforehand, and they that are otherwise cannot be hid. You see, it was common in the first century when those who are being appointed to a special work, it'd be like a little ceremony, and you would lay hands on them. Now, the apostles would lay hands on people to impart spiritual gifts. But that's not the only time people would lay hands on someone. When we appoint elders here, we made a special point. We had a little bit of a a ceremony about that because of the importance of what we're doing. I've been places where we've appointed elders, and I've always sort of tried to make it a point to put my hand on them as they're being appointed, not as some kind of a spiritual gift, impartation or something like that. And it's usually on the shoulder. I don't make a big deal out of it. But there's just sort of a way of acknowledging them in that office, to have some kind of laying on of hands as part of that little appointment ceremony. And you read about this several times in the New Testament that's not connected with miraculous gifts. But don't be too quick to appoint someone as an elder. You need to take some time with this. A lot of times someone comes in to a congregation. I was a part of a congregation once. As soon as I got there, they acted like they wanted me to be one of the elders, and I didn't want to do that. They did not know me. And in fact, I was preaching for them. I said, look, you don't even know how I preach. Why don't you let me preach for a few months and decide if you really want me to have anything to do with this. So they let it work in that way. But you need to take this slow, because the first impressions might deceive you. Now, with some folks, it's not. I mean, some folk, you can tell right away, this person should not be an elder. It says some men's sins are open beforehand. I mean, right up front, you can realize, now this is not what we're going to need among elders. But some are not so obvious. And who they are, it comes out later on, doesn't it? They say if you really want to test a man, empower him and see how he handles that. You know, when it comes to deacons that are first be proved, if that's important for deacons, think how much more that would be important when someone's being appointed as an elder. So you don't rush into this. And then it says, likewise, the good works of some are manifest beforehand. You know, sometimes you can just tell right away. This is quality people. It's hard to hide good works. Now, Jesus warns us about not giving on before men. You're not putting on a show, but just like Moses warned the tribe of Reuben when he said, be sure your sins will find you out. You know, your good works find you out too. You don't hide these things. People get the idea, especially over time, they come to understand what kind of person you are. But what about those that are otherwise? Now, they might hide their evil works for a while, but it surfaces. They that are otherwise cannot be hid. Now, there's the context. You can see how that'd be something that the whole church needs to hear. Right in the middle of this, what I left out are these personal admonitions for Timothy. He says, neither be partakers of other men's sins. Keep thyself pure. Drink no longer water, but use a little wine for thy stomach's sake and thine oft infirmities. Let's look at these personal admonitions that are in here, almost seemingly out of context. Neither be partakers of other man's sins. You know, if you just go along with other men's sins, then you become the sinner yourself. I would compare this to 2 John verses 10 and 11. If there come in you, bring not this doctrine, receiving not into your house, neither bidding Godspeed. He that biddeth him Godspeed is partaker of his evil deeds. It'd be easy, wouldn't it, for elders, if they're slipping off, to maybe just kind of go along with it. Or just maybe ignore that. Don't be partakers of other man's sins. And then he says, keep thyself pure. Now, in this context, what we're about to see is, why would he say keep thyself pure? You know, it may be Timothy was living according to the instructions Paul had earlier written to the church at Rome. We said, it's good neither to eat flesh nor drink wine nor anything whereby thy brother stumbleth or is offended or is made weak. Just don't drink any wine at all. And so Timothy may be doing that. Now, people use that sometimes and say, see, it's just a matter of conscience. That's all it is. Now wait a minute. What's Paul talking about in Romans 14? Why is he telling them not to drink any wine if your brother be offended? Is it because it's alcoholic? That's not what Paul's talking about. That's in the context of idolatry. Wine and meats would be offered to idols, and your brother seeing you go to the market and purchase these things offered to idols, why to eat those things, they'd been taught that was participating with that idol. And so we're in a context of idolatry. It's not about alcohol here. And you'd have to assume this wine was alcoholic to get alcohol here, because fresh wine, the first fruits, are offered to idols. So it could be Timothy's avoiding all wine because you don't want to offend anyone. And so Paul says, drink no longer water, but use a little wine. The immediate context is hard to see how all this fits. But there's another context here where Paul had already addressed drinking wine in the book of 1 Timothy. And we got to take that into consideration. When he's talking about the qualifications of elders, he says there, an elder must be not given to wine. Now that may not be the best way to translate what he's saying here. The word for wine is oinos, and para means besides, and this word means, this word not given to wine, it's para oinos. What does this mean is, elders, don't be beside the wine. If I want to paraphrase this, just stay away from it. That's what he's telling. Elders, just stay away from it. Don't go around it. Don't be beside of it. And then you come to deacons. And there it says, likewise, the deacons must be not given to much wine. You see how those two things translated the same? Some infer from that Paul is telling deacons, now you can have a little wine. Elders, you just stay away from it. But deacons, now you can have a little. Is that what Paul's teaching? Well, it's not what he's teaching. You know, the fact that he says not much does not mean that you have permission for a little. James is going to warn Christians in the book of James about the superfluity of naughtiness. Does that mean James is teaching you can be just a little naughty? No, the superfluity of naughtiness. That doesn't mean you can be a little naughty. I remember my father. I'd be growing up. I'd leave the house. One of the things he'd tell me is I'd leave the house and I don't get into a lot of trouble. You know, I knew he was not giving me permission to get into a little trouble. I knew that. So the much does not imply the little. And what we're talking about when it's talking about being given, this is talking about an addiction. Don't be addicted to much wine. You take a man that has a drinking problem, he does not need to be a deacon. But he's not saying here, but it's all right if they're addicted to a little wine. That's reading something into this text that is foreign to what Paul is talking about. So you've got these warnings about wine, and then he's going to tell Timothy to use a little wine. We need to look at that in light of these warnings he's been given in this epistle, don't we? If we're going to keep it in context. So let's see what we're talking about. Look what he did not say. We got to look at what he did say and what he did not say. He said, use a little wine for thy stomach's sake and thine oft infirmities. Now, he did not say use a little wine to be sociable. He did not say use a little wine to get a little buzz. He did not say use a little wine to chill out. And people that take wine for those reasons and then turn to this passage and say, well, didn't Paul say use a little wine? Yeah, but he said why to use it? For thy stomach's sake and thine off infirmities. There's some kind of physical ailment that Timothy has that Paul doesn't go into details about what that is, but he said, now you use a little wine for that reason. We got to look at the reason behind this. You know, it's one thing to take drugs for medicine and a whole other thing to take them for a thrill. A lot of the time prescribed drugs, you need to, I know with the elderly, I know this, some of them you just need to lock them up because people will break in and steal those just because they want the effects of the drug. It's not about taking as a treating an ailment or a medicine. Those are two different matters, reasons to take drugs, isn't it? So he's saying use a little wine as a medicinal thing. But look what else he says here. Drink no longer water. Well, you have to understand the way Paul writes, and he does this so many times. And if you remember this, it'll help unravel so many passages. It's called an elliptical statement in which the complete thought is not given. He doesn't say, he's not telling Jimmy that you can't drink any water anymore. That's not what he's saying. It's drink no water only. But use a little wine also. Now let me paraphrase. Put a little water, put a little wine in your water. And why would he want to put a little wine in his water? Well, one of the suggestions that I think we got to consider here is could have been he had bad water. That it was the water that was causing his ailments. And a little alcohol in the water would be used to treat the water so that it wouldn't be as the bacteria or whatever it was he's trying to kill with a little alcohol in it would purify that water. Well, now that doesn't sound like an intoxicating drink to use a little water as a water treatment. And that's not why people are drinking wine today, are they? People don't drink wine because they're not putting a little wine in their water because the water's bad. If that's what Paul was telling Timothy to do, which it could have been, that still is not what people are doing today when they're drinking their wine, are they? Let's look at this. Let's look at the wine. Use a little wine. And people look at that and go to the grocery store. I was there the other day at a grocery store. We were there to get milk or something, and I was just looking around. Man, there are just shelves and shelves of all kinds of wine. There must be a lot of it consumed. It's in every grocery store in a big section. If they weren't making money on it, they wouldn't have that many shelves of it. That is not what Paul was talking about. Modern wines are different than the ancient Bible wines. If you want to take modern wines, take some modern wine and an equal amount of water and cut that wine in half with water, and now you're getting to the alcoholic content of ancient wines. It's about half what people are drinking today. And not only that, that's not how they drink it. They didn't drink it that way. Cut it in half again. Because people did not drink just wine. In those days, they would dilute it with water. Sometimes at a ratio of 5 parts water to 1 part wine. Now, that's just not the way people drink wine today. And so to apply something like that to that wine that you're going to see in the grocery store, you're talking about two different kinds of drink, aren't you? Now, let's look at the word wine anyway. Because in the Bible, the word wine is not necessarily an alcoholic beverage. Wine is any of the juice that comes from the grape, whether it be fresh or preserved or fermented or soured into vinegar. It was all called wine. And the Bible uses this word wine for fresh wine that has not been fermented. Matthew 19:17. Neither do men put new wine in old bottles, else the bottles break and the wine runneth out and the bottles perish, but put new wine in new bottles, and both are preserved. Now it's talking about, does that mean it keeps it from becoming alcoholic? Well, it could. You could preserve it that way if you could seal it up right. But even if it didn't, what are they putting into the bottle? The new wine, it's the same word. And this is wine that had not been fermented, else it wouldn't have swollen the bottles. And that word is used about 6 or 7 times in Matthew 9:17, Mark 2:22, Luke 5:37 through 38. You count them up about 6 or 7 times. The word wine is used for wine that is not alcoholic. It's the wine poured into the bottle is not alcoholic. It hadn't been fermented yet. There's another word used 5 times in the New Testament. It's translated this way. It's translated wine press. Matthew 21:33. There's a certain householder which planted a vineyard and hedged it around and digged a wine press in it. One word, one English word, wine press. But it comes from 2 Greek words. And if you wanted to translate that more accurately, it was a press of the wine. You see, you'd take the wine, and to get the juice out of it, you'd put it in a wine press. Well, what is it pressing out? It's pressing out the juice from that grape. And that's the press that delivers that juice from the grape. That juice is called the wine when it's called a press of the wine. So again, you're talking about a wine here that is fresh. It hasn't been fermented. Now, in the book of Isaiah, the prophet talks about wine that is in the cluster. It's still in the grape. It hadn't even been pressed out yet. Okay, Isaiah preached in Hebrew, but about 200 years before Christ, some Jewish scholars in Alexandria, Egypt, took their Hebrew scriptures and translated it into Greek. And they call it the Septuagint translation. And when they came to this word that Isaiah used, when he said wine is found in the cluster, they used the same Greek word for wine that's used for wine in the New Testament. And so obviously it's not talking about an alcoholic beverage here. It's talking about the juice that is in that grape. Now, those that use this verse to say, see, it says drink a little wine, and use that to justify their grocery store wine that they're drinking, they are assuming that Paul is telling Timothy to drink alcoholic wine. But then they're assuming the very thing they're trying to prove when they turn to this passage. I thought this was interesting. Oh, I meant to bring these books. I'll bring these next time. I've got some extras of these. There's a little book written by William Patton on Bible wines. It is so interesting. I'm sorry I left those at home. I've got 4 or 5 that I can bring if you want to pursue this more, and I'll mention this again next time. But in that book, it describes the ancient wine, how it was produced, the various ways wine could be preserved. And on page 94, now I paraphrase this a little bit from that book, but on page 94, there was a fella named Athenius about the year 200 that says, let him take sweet wine, either mixed with water or warmed. Now look, especially that which readily flows from the grape, that'd be fresh, is being very good for the stomach. I used to have a little stomach trouble, and my mother did not give me wine. She gave me ginger ale. In fact, I still think of my stomach trouble when I drink 7-Up. She'd bring me 7-Up and soda crackers. Well, a little sweet drink was to help my stomach. And you could do that with grape juice. And I would advise to dilute it. Don't just serve straight grape juice. Dilute it about half with water and a little of it to get a little sweetness to settle down in the stomach. And so that can be used for stomach's sake or off infirmities. The thing is, you can't prove that the wine here Timothy is told to use was alcoholic wine. And if you can't prove it was alcoholic wine, you can't use this text to say, therefore, I'm going to drink my grocery store wine. Here's what my daddy told me. When I was a young man, I brought this passage up. I said, Daddy, Paul told Timothy, use a little wine for thy stomach's sake and off infirmities. My dear daddy answered me like this. He said, before anyone uses this to justify their drinking, they need to make sure they're drinking what Timothy drank for the reason he drank it. It's not good Bible study to take a passage and isolate it and ignore everything else because you think this is going to get you off and let you do what you want to do. That's not the right way to approach the Bible. What was Paul telling Timothy to drink? Why was he telling him to drink it? And that needs to be considered when we're looking at this. And considering those differences in wines, in their water, in available medicines that we have today that they did not have, in the way people drink today. And it may have been good enough in the AD 60s for Paul to tell Timothy, drink no longer water, but use a little wine. But I tell you, today a lot of people would be better off if they would drink no longer wine and use a little water. Well, I've been asked by Alan Webster to write an article for the Spiritual Sword on this word sober. There's actually 3 words I've studied in that article about that, and I've written that. It's going to come out in July. It's going to be a whole issue of the Spiritual Sword on alcohol. And when it says in 1 Thessalonians 5, 7, and 8, they that be drunken are drunken in the night, but let those who are of the day be sober. You know what sober means, don't you? The context tells you. Sober means not drunk. And Vine's expository dictionary of New Testament words, when it's describing this word translated sober, it says free from the influence of intoxicants. Ephesians 5 and verse 18, be not drunk with wine, wherein is excess, but be filled with the Spirit. That does not say don't drink to excess. That's not what it says. Don't be drunk with wine wherein is excess. The excess is in the wine. It's not in the person until they drink it. And why would someone want to have alcohol as a drug? What are they seeking? Why would they desire that? There's something in their life that's troubling them, some kind of escape, and they're turning to the wrong source. If you got problems in your life, don't turn to alcohol. Don't turn to drugs. Don't turn to worldly things. Turn to the living water, where if you'll drink and you never thirst again, there'll always be a spring of water springing up into everlasting life. Turn to the Spirit. And don't try to drown yourselves and drink your troubles away with alcohol. What you need is Jesus. What you need is the Holy Spirit. What you need are the words in this book. And you'll lose all that desire for worldly things because you'll be satisfied without that. So, what do we learn? Do nothing by partiality. I tell you, when it comes to taking care of the church, it's not time for partiality. There's things like nepotism, where you're favoring your family. Things like simony, where you're trying to buy yourself into things. And there's all kind of ways you can do this wrong. Do nothing by partiality. And keep thyself pure. Pay attention to that. And be careful about folks. See, the kind of person a person is, it'll come out. It comes out, but it comes out over time. Be careful. So many good words of admonition here. But then also one of these words, take care of yourself. Timothy needed to take care of himself. He may have been so scrupulous that he was denying himself things that would have been good for him if he would use them in the right way. And we need to take care of ourselves. If we can take care of ourselves, we'll be in a better position to take care of others and take care of the Lord's work as well. Are you filled with the Spirit? That's what you need. You know, when Paul wrote that in the book of Colossians, he said, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly with all wisdom. That is what will fill you with the Spirit. And so you need to turn to God and come to Jesus. And if you need to do that this morning, we can either baptize you into Christ, or if you've got a special problems, we can go together as a family of God and pray for you concerning those things. And with that, I offer the invitation as we stand and sing.